A father interrupted the funeral of his own little daughter because he saw something moving in her mouth. You won't believe what it was and what happened next. David was a single father raising his tiny daughter. His wife had been cheating on him with many others for many years, but he had lasted by her side for as long as he could, and he forgave her for all of her side jumping. At some point, David's wife became pregnant. The man didn't fully know who the father of the child was, but he loved Emily from the first moment he saw her. Unfortunately, the girl's mother had something like postpartum depression and couldn't even look at her daughter. She turned her off and one day just packed up and went somewhere. After that, David was left alone, completely alone. As you can guess, being a single father with no experience can't be an easy task. It was very hard for David, but his love for his daughter drove him forward every day. He managed to survive the first year with his daughter, and after some time he put her in daycare and was able to take care of the day job. David was a copywriter and wrote texts for various advertising agencies. He didn't earn much from it, but there was enough to provide a decent living for himself and his daughter. Unfortunately, nothing prepared him for yet another unpleasant surprise that fate was preparing for him. Emily developed properly until the age of 5. No one expected that this young child would soon be fighting for her life. One day, David was asked to pick up his daughter from daycare early. The caregivers were concerned because the little one was constantly sick. At home, it turned out that Emily was spitting blood. Terrified, David immediately took her to the hospital. However, the doctors were unable to give a reason for this. It was possible that Emily suffered from some extreme rare genetic disease that local medics were unable to diagnose. David didn't have the money to go somewhere with his daughter to other countries in search of other specialists. So he decided to treat his daughter himself. He did everything a desperate father can do for a dying child. He went to church and on his knees begged God for a miraculous healing of his daughter. Unfortunately, God was likely deaf to his pleas. Finding no comfort in the church, David also began making appointments with various psychics. One day he went to see his aunt, who read from the cards whether his daughter would survive and come out of her illness all right. Apparently, it was written in the cards that everything was in David's hands. For the man, this was the only positive information he'd heard from anyone, so David decided to stick with it. He searched the web for a lot of information on natural treatments and tried many on his daughter. Unfortunately, one day she just didn't wake up in the morning. The disease had overcome her. The child passed away to the angels at the age of 5. David sat distraught in the front row of the small chapel a few days later, staring at the closed casket containing the body of his beloved daughter. Streams of tears streamed down his face as he recalled all the happy moments they got through together. Emily had always been a very well-developed and adventurous child. She was eager to explore the unknown and learn new things. Unfortunately, a terrible illness took her away from him far too soon, leaving David with a broken heart and no hope for a better tomorrow. When the funeral service began, David struggled to pull himself together and stood up for the arrival of the priest. He listened as the priest talked about the importance of finding comfort and knowing that Emily was now in God's arms. As the priest continued the funeral service, David's family had a habit of washing the dead's face, so he asked the priest to do so, and he allowed that. But David's attention was suddenly drawn to a strange movement coming from his daughter's casket. He watched in horror as something began to emerge from between the folds of her dress and then from her mouth. At first he thought it might be a piece of cloth. However, this was still writhing and shocked David. He walked closer to his daughter until he froze. He realized what was happening. What was coming out of the girl's mouth was a writhing mass of worms. David was overwhelmed by panic. The father sprang to his feet and threw himself into the coffin, desperately trying to pull the worms out of Emily's mouth. The pastor and mourners watched in shock as David frantically tried to save his daughter from the vermin. Finally, however, with a rush of adrenaline, he managed to remove the worms and toss them aside. When he turned back to the coffin, he was amazed to see that Emily's cheeks had begun to flush, and her chest was rising and falling with shallow breaths. By some miracle, Emily was still alive. All the mourners were shocked by what had happened. Even the priest in charge fainted from the sensation. David, however, knew perfectly well what had happened and where those worms had come from in his daughter's body. As it turns out, The worms were actually a rare medicine that had been used on Emily secretly by a desperate David who was willing to try anything to save his beloved daughter. He read somewhere on the internet that some varieties of worms act like leeches and are able to suck the disease out of a person. Although David would not normally believe such a thing, inspired by the words of the article, he knew that everything was in his hands and believed that his daughter would survive. As it turned out, the fortune teller, his aunt, was right. Overwhelmed with joy and gratitude, David fell to his knees and wept tears of joy as Emily slowly opened her eyes and looked at him with a slight smile. From that day on, David knew that he would always remember the moment when he interrupted his daughter's funeral and was blessed with a second chance to live with her. After everything was over, he also went to his aunt and thanked her very sincerely for her help. The woman was quite surprised at what had taken place. It's possible that she herself did not realize how her words had affected David. Nevertheless, by some twisted means, the woman contributed to saving David's daughter. One day at work, David was totally taken aback by the sudden appearance of a famous broadcaster. Her name was Susan. Susan was a pretty woman with very attractive eyes and a fit body. Susan heard about David's story from her daughter, Emily. Susan admired this man very much, and she decided to go to him to thank him personally and to thank him for his limitless love for his daughter. Susan also desired to invite David to her program to tell the audience his amazing story with this tiny girl from the very beginning to the end. David agreed with no hesitation, and he finally found his opportunity to deliver a message to some parents in the program. David advised those careless parents to take care of their children and to do their best for their benefits and interests. In addition, David said a very important sentence that urges those who suffer from frustration in their lives not to give up and not to be hopeless, no matter how, as long as we're alive. There must be even a tiny shadow of hope. According to David, by the end of her television show, Susan expressed her gratitude for David for his coming and for his valuable talk and advice for anyone who is responsible for making others' lives better and easier. Susan herself was impressed with David's wonderful character. She felt something strange towards this man. After she ended her TV show and went home, she couldn't sleep. The same happened to David throughout the show. He could not keep his eyes away from Susan. In fact, Susan had a very attractive and good-looking appearance. Susan was a beautiful, confident, strong, and cheerful person. While she was talking, she was reminding David of his late wife. This was the first time for David to find a woman who had almost all the qualities of his beloved wife. David could not prevent himself from calling Susan. He didn't know that she was also still awake. David asked her to agree to meet the day after. Susan couldn't believe what was happening. David called her at the same moment she was about to hold her mobile phone to call him. Susan was very happy with David's care for her. They met each other, and they described to each other how much they were attached in such a short period. Their relationship was developing. In fact, what was happening to David was unexpected. David was a widower who was always faithful and sincere to his wife even after she died. David's life was turned upside down in the moment when he saw Susan enter his office at work. At first, David exerted his utmost efforts in order not to fall in love with Susan, but he failed. What encouraged David to continue his relationship with Susan was that Susan was compassionate, emotional, hopeful, romantic, and kind-hearted. Thus, he thought that Susan would be a tender mother for his daughter, Emily. David was still 35, so he needed a woman in his life. He needed a loving wife to support him in difficult times and to make it easier for him to go through them. Besides, he needed a mother for Emily to give her all the motherhood emotions she was deprived of after her mother died. David saw that Susan seemed like the perfect choice for him, and also for Emily, especially because she loved Emily very much and often bought her presents and made surprises for her. This made Emily like Susan and get used to her existence in her life. If Susan did not come to see Emily one day, she appeared very sad. But what Susan did put David in for a great surprise. When David asked Susan to accept his marriage proposal, Susan replied that she would agree only on one condition. To clarify, Susan asked David to let Emily live with her grandmother when they got married. As Susan desired to live with David alone in the house, she didn't want anyone to live with them. However, David refused to let his daughter live away from them. David decided to forget Susan forever as he saw that his daughter deserved his attention, care, and love more than anybody else. David was a really great father.